The morning of the wedding arrived with a sky so clear it seemed staged, as though even the weather had been hired for the occasion. The Whitmore estate, an old southern colonial mansion with white columns rising like sentinels along its front, had been transformed overnight into something out of a magazine spread. Rows of gold Chiavari chairs lined across the lawn, white roses and hydrangeas woven into every railing and archway, an American flag stirring gently above the crowd as if blessing the union about to take place beneath it. 200 guests had gathered in linen and silk, champagne flutes catching the morning light, all of them waiting for the moment that had been talked about in society columns for months. The marriage of Julian Hale, heir to one of the country's largest hospitality empires, to Camille Whitmore, a woman whose beauty had opened every door that her family's old money hadn't already unlocked for her. Among the staff hired to manage the reception was a young woman named Priya, new to catering work but not new to hard labor, having spent the last 3 years balancing school and odd jobs to support her mother back home. She had taken the wedding gig through an agency that promised good pay for a single weekend of work, and though she had never worked an event of this scale before, she carried herself with the same quiet competence she brought to everything, moving trays with careful hands, refilling glasses before they were empty, anticipating needs before they were spoken. She had noticed, early in the morning as the staff prepared the reception tables, that the bride possessed a temper sharper than her smile suggested, snapping at a florist over the placement of a single stem, dismissing a hairstylist mid-sentence for daring to suggest an alternate style. Priya had simply kept her head down, the way she always did, telling herself that today was not about her, that her job was to be invisible until she was needed and forgotten the moment she wasn't. The ceremony itself passed in a blur of vows and applause, Julian and Camille standing beneath a floral arch as a string quartet played something soft and familiar, the guests dabbing at their eyes, the whole scene unfolding exactly as it had been designed to. Julian, for his part, looked every bit the groom the tabloids had built him up to be, tall and composed in a navy suit, a white boutonniere pinned neatly to his lapel. His expression carrying the particular mixture of relief and hope that comes with finally reaching a day you've spent a year planning. He had known Camille for 3 years, had fallen for her charm before he'd had the chance to notice the sharper edges beneath it, and like many people deeply invested in a story they've already told themselves, he had learned to explain away the moments that didn't fit the narrative he wanted to believe. It was during the reception, as guests began moving from their seats toward the long dessert table set beneath a canopy of white orchids, that everything shifted. Priya had been assigned to plate the final course, a delicate arrangement of pastries and glazed fruit tarts that had taken the catering team the better part of 2 days to prepare. She was leaning slightly over the table, adjusting a tray that had been placed unevenly, when Camille approached from behind, still in her wedding gown, the lace train trailing over the grass, her tiara catching the afternoon sun. What happened next unfolded in seconds, though it would feel, to everyone who witnessed it, as though time itself had slowed to make sure no detail was missed. Camille, irritated that a tray of desserts had been placed slightly off-center from where she had specifically instructed, reached out and grabbed the back of Priya's head, shoving her face down hard into the very tray she had been adjusting. The sound of the impact, sharp and wet against porcelain and pastry, cut through the low hum of conversation like a gunshot. For a moment, no one moved. Champagne glasses hovered midair. Conversations died mid-sentence. Every guest within view turned toward the sound, hands rising instinctively to cover open mouths, eyes wide with the particular horror of witnessing something so casually cruel that the mind needs a moment to process it as real. Priya straightened slowly, frosting and shattered pastry clinging to her cheek and hair, her eyes stinging not from the food but from the humiliation crashing over her in the presence of 200 strangers. She said nothing. She had learned, in 3 years of service work, that saying nothing was often the safest thing a person in her position could do. That anger, however justified, could cost her more than the moment itself was worth. But her hands trembled as she reached for a napkin, and in that trembling was a fear and a shame that no apology could easily undo. Camille, for her part, seemed almost amused, glancing around at the stunned crowd with the beginning of a laugh forming at the corner of her mouth, as though she expected the moment to pass the way so many of her outbursts had passed before, absorbed quietly by people too afraid or too polite to challenge her. She opened her mouth to say something dismissive, something about clumsy staff or misplaced trays, but the words never fully left her, because it was in that exact moment that Julian, who had been speaking with his best man only feet away, turned and saw what his bride had just done. He did not shout. He did not immediately storm across the lawn in a dramatic display for the crowd, though every instinct in him wanted to. Instead, he simply stopped, his champagne glass held loosely in one hand, his face draining of the easy warmth it had carried all afternoon, replaced by something colder and more focused, the expression of a man recalibrating everything he thought he understood about the person he had just promised his life to. He set the glass down on the nearest table, the sound of it landing sharper than intended, and crossed the lawn in a handful of long strides. He reached Priya first. He asked her, quietly, if she was all right, his voice gentler than anyone at the wedding had ever heard him use in public, and when she nodded, too stunned to speak, he turned to face Camille with an expression that made the entire reception go utterly silent, the string quartet's music the only sound left drifting across the lawn. He asked her, in front of everyone, why she had done it. Camille, caught off guard by the sudden shift in attention, tried to laugh it off, waving a dismissive hand and calling it an accident, insisting the girl had been careless with the tray and deserved a small lesson in attentiveness. But the crowd had seen it plainly, and Julian, more than anyone, had seen the truth in the sharp, deliberate motion of his bride's hand against another human being's face. He told her, his voice low but carrying across the silent lawn, that he had spent 3 years explaining away moments like this one, telling himself she was simply particular, simply passionate, simply misunderstood by people who didn't know her the way he did. He told her that today, on their wedding day, in front of everyone who mattered to them both, she had finally shown him exactly who she was, and that he could no longer pretend otherwise. Camille's composure cracked for the first time, her voice rising in disbelief as she reminded him that they were married now, that whatever had just happened didn't erase the vows they had spoken less than an hour earlier. Julian looked at her for a long moment, and then, in front of the entire assembled crowd, he said the words that would be repeated in whispered conversations for months afterward, that a piece of paper signed an hour ago did not obligate him to spend the rest of his life defending cruelty, and that he would rather walk away from every plan they had made than build a marriage on the kind of person willing to humiliate someone simply because she could. He turned from her then and knelt beside Priya, who had sunk into a nearby chair, still trying to process what had happened to her in front of so many strangers. He asked if she needed anything, if she wanted to leave, if there was someone he could call for her, and when she finally found her voice, thin and shaking, she told him she just wanted to go home. Julian nodded, and without hesitation, instructed his driver to take her wherever she needed to go, personally walking her to the car himself while 200 wedding guests watched in stunned silence, the bride standing alone amid the wreckage of a wedding that had ended before the reception dinner had even been served. The days that followed brought a media storm neither Julian nor Camille had anticipated, footage from a guest's phone circulating faster than either family's publicists could manage, the image of a bride shoving a young caterer's face into a dessert tray becoming, almost overnight, a symbol of the very entitlement so many people suspected lived beneath the polished surface of families like the Whitmores. Camille's attempts to explain herself in a hastily arranged statement only deepened the public's anger, her words carrying the same dismissiveness that had caused the incident in the first place. Julian, for his part, said little publicly, focusing instead on quietly ensuring that Priya was compensated fairly, that her position with the catering agency remained secure despite the chaos surrounding the event, and that she was never made to feel, even for a moment, that she bore any responsibility for what had happened to her. It was in the quiet aftermath, away from cameras and headlines, that something unexpected began to take shape. Julian reached out to Priya not out of guilt alone but out of a genuine desire to understand who she was, the woman his fiancée had so carelessly dismissed as invisible. Their first real conversation happened weeks later, in a quiet coffee shop far from the reach of society photographers, where Julian, still working through the wreckage of a cancelled marriage and a public relations nightmare, found himself talking with Priya not as an apology ode but as a person genuinely curious about her life. She told him about her mother, about the classes she was taking in the evenings, about the quiet resilience that had carried her through years of work most people never noticed. He found himself listening in a way he realized, with some discomfort, he had rarely done with Camille, who had always seemed to prefer being heard over listening. Their friendship grew slowly and carefully, neither of them rushing toward anything neither was ready for. Julian, humbled by the very public collapse of the life he had spent years building, found himself reconsidering not just his marriage but the values he had allowed to guide him, the way wealth and status had shielded him from truly seeing the people who worked to make his world function. Priya, cautious after years of learning that people in Julian's world rarely looked twice at people in hers, took her time trusting that his interest in her was sincere and not simply another passing curiosity for a man used to getting what he wanted. Months passed before either of them acknowledged what had quietly grown between them. It happened one evening at a small gathering Julian had organized, not at the Whitmore estate or any of his family's more ostentatious properties, but at a modest community center where he had begun funding scholarship programs for young people balancing work and education, a project inspired, though he rarely said so directly, by conversations with Priya about the opportunities she had fought so hard to create for herself. Watching her move confidently through the room, speaking with the very people the programs were meant to help, Julian understood with sudden clarity that the qualities Camille had so casually dismissed as beneath her notice were exactly the qualities he valued most in the world. He did not propose that night, understanding that both of them needed time before either was ready for something so significant, but he did finally tell her plainly what he had come to feel, that the humiliation she had suffered at his wedding had somehow, against every reasonable expectation, led him toward a life he valued far more than the one he had nearly built with someone who had never truly seen the people around her. Priya, hearing him say it so directly, felt something in her chest loosen that had been tight since that terrible afternoon on the Whitmore lawn. A quiet, cautious hope that perhaps not every wealthy man moved through the world the way Camille had taught her to expect. Their relationship, when it finally became something both of them were ready to acknowledge publicly, unfolded far from the spectacle that had once defined Julian's life. There were no grand society announcements, no elaborate parties designed for photographers, only a quiet, steady partnership built on the kind of mutual respect neither had fully experienced before. Priya finished her degree with Julian quietly supporting her ambitions rather than overshadowing them, and Julian, for his part, found himself slowly stepping back from the more performative aspects of the world he had inherited, choosing instead to build something that felt more honest, guided by a woman who had taught him, without ever intending to, what it truly meant to see the people so easily overlooked by those with power. Years later, when people occasionally brought up the infamous wedding that had once dominated headlines, Julian would simply say that it had been the worst day of his life and, in the strangest way, the beginning of the best one, a single cruel moment revealing exactly who deserved to remain in his life and who never truly belonged there at all. Priya, when asked, rarely spoke of the humiliation itself, choosing instead to speak of the quiet, steady kindness that had followed it. Proof, she often said, that sometimes the people who see you most clearly are the ones the world has taught you never to expect.